My name is Barry Tillman, and I'm glad you joined me to talk about closing the yield gap between yield potential and achieved yield, a focus on peanut variety. This is part one of three parts where we will introduce what we mean by yield gap and achieved yield, and then the next two sections will focus on what the factors are that reduce yield potential in our in field settings. And the last section, section 3, will focus on how we can manage peanut varieties specifically to maximize their potential yield. Let's start out with some definitions. First, what is yield and yield potential? We're going to define yield as the actual farmer stock tons harvested per acre, and yield potential as the maximum economically viable yield of a peanut variety. The same with grade. The Federal State Inspection Service grade is what we actually achieve per ton of farmer stock, and the grade potential is the maximum economically viable grade of a variety. So in summary, potential yield is what is possible. The actual yield is what we're achieving on a farm setting, and the gap is the actual yield minus the potential yield. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to focus on peanut varieties in terms of maximizing yield potential. And we can say that peanut varieties are not plug-and-play devices like our cell phones and computers and other devices that exist in this computer device technology world that we live in. So each variety must be managed to bolster its weaknesses and accentuate its strengths. And that's what we want to talk about throughout this entire presentation, is how do we maximize the potential of the variety by minimizing the losses due to its weaknesses and maximizing its strengths to produce the highest yield. And in order to understand what the yield gap is in peanut, we first have to understand what the actual peanut yield is and the yield potential. Let's start with the actual peanut yield. Here we find summarized data from the USDA, National Agricultural Statistics Service, for peanut yields in the 5 southern states. And we can see here that in the most recent year where we have data, the yield, actual farmer stock yield, is between 4,000 pounds per acre and about 5,000 pounds per acre. So 4,000 to 5,000 pounds per acre. And if we look at a weighted average, because each state grows a different amount of acreage, we can say that the yield of peanut is around 4,000 to 4,500 pounds per acre in the southeastern USA. The next part of the yield gap calculation is determining what the peanut yield potential is. And we can do that based on the small plot yield test that universities such as the University of Florida grow. And we see that on average about 6,000 to 7,000 pounds per acre is achieved under irrigation, and about 4,500 to 5,500 pounds is achieved on non-irrigated tests. It's probably higher in more favorable conditions, but these tests are grown in the most favorable conditions that we can possibly achieve, and so they would come the closest to estimating the actual yield potential. And here we have an example of yield potential from the University of Florida statewide variety test from a 3-year period. Looking here at the top 4 varieties, we see that the average yields are about 7,000 pounds per acre under irrigation, and under non-irrigated conditions, which is the orange bar, around 5,500 pounds per acre on average. And so if we think back to that actual achieved yield of 4,000 to 4,500 pounds per acre, we see that there's a significant yield gap between what we're achieving in the field and what these varieties are capable of producing under the best conditions. And here's another example from the University of Georgia statewide variety test from a 3-year period in 3 locations. If we see here, the yield potential under irrigation is around 6,000 pounds per acre for these top 4 varieties, and some of them are the same varieties that were in the Florida data set. And under non-irrigated conditions, about 4,500 pounds per acre. So again, a significant yield gap exists between the potential that there is in these tests that are grown under optimum conditions and those that are being achieved on our farmers' fields. And we want to begin to think about why that's the case. What are those optimum conditions that we're using to achieve these yields, and can we replicate those in a field setting? I thought it'd be fun to throw in an example of a yield potential from giant pumpkin. We see here that there's a winner crowned of a giant pumpkin that weighed 1,964 pounds. The variety was Liggett, as you see here. Not every Liggett variety that was planted that year produced the winning pumpkin, but there are many of them on the stage that are Liggett variety. And so it makes sense that if we can maximize the potential of that variety, we have a much better chance of producing the highest yields. So that's what we want to look at next, is what are What can we do to maximize the yields of these best varieties? Just to summarize part one of this presentation, what is the yield potential? Based on small plot tests, we've been able to define the yield potential of peanut at around 6,000 to 7,000 pounds per acre under irrigation and 4,500 to 5,500 pounds per acre in non-irrigated situations. Well, are these just giant pumpkin yields that are unachievable in actual farming? That's a gap of 1,500 to 2,500 pounds per acre. So can we close that yield gap? I hope you'll watch part two for the answer.